Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the show. As ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Yaakov Lapin, in-house analyst here at the MirYam Institute. And just before we get to the discussion today, I want to appeal to all of you. If you're enjoying this content, please be sure to partner with us and to leave a rating and review at wherever it is you download this podcast from. And also be sure to subscribe to the podcast to make sure that you never miss an episode. Furthermore, please be aware of the fact that all of this audio content is available on our YouTube channel. Just go into YouTube and look for the MirYam Institute, MIRYAM. I very much look forward to having your support and cooperation in that regard, and I thank you in advance of that. Now, I'm going to kick off this show with a discussion about a hearing that is taking place in the Supreme Court, and essentially the aspect of that hearing that I want to focus on with you, Yaakov, is the question of whether or not the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is able to fire and dismiss the current chief of the Shin-Bet, that's the Internal Security Agency of the State of Israel, Ronen Bar. And it made for very interesting viewing today and for some very lively events inside the chamber of the Supreme Court. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, look, I'm not a legal expert, but my reading of the law, my cursory reading, was that the government is allowed to fire prematurely the head of the Shin-Bet. That's written into the Shin-Bet law, and they're allowed to terminate his term prematurely. That's all written in stone. So the Supreme Court has been petitioned, and it's now deliberating on this decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the cabinet to fire the Shin-Bet chief. And the counterclaim is that this firing is motivated by the investigation that the Shin-Bet is involved in, which is known as Qatargate, which I'm sure most of our listeners and viewers know is a series of suspicions that Netanyahu's inner circle was taking Qatari money and promoting Qatari interests in a manner that actually threatened Israeli security. That's the charge. And Netanyahu is saying, actually, it's the other way around. This investigation was launched in order to undermine my rule, my authority, my policies, and it's part of one overarching effort by a series of entrenched power centers, which he often refers to as the deep state. And now we have this political feuding back and forth. Now, the way I see it is, first of all, this isn't really about the law. This is a political feud. That's my gut reaction to all of it. And everybody who's taking a side, one way or the other, is doing so on the basis of their political allegiance. And there are a few voices that are not doing that, but I think most voices are doing that. And it's incredibly dangerous because I think this is one of the most internally divisive moments that we have had here in the state of Israel. This obviously is bad for our security when we have the government and the Supreme Court and the heads of the Shin-Bet at each other's throat. Now, the good news is that the chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, because he takes a completely different approach from his predecessor, Herzi Halevi, and he is one who's, in my view, doing absolutely the right thing, what a chief of staff should be doing, which is obviously in behind closed doors, share your assessment, argue your assessment. That's absolutely fine. But when the directive comes down from the security cabinet, from the government, you follow that directive, and your main focus is to destroy the enemy. That's the main focus of the chief of staff. Eyal Zamir, in my opinion, has begun doing that. He hit the ground running. From the moment he was appointed, he began going over battle plans, Southern Command. Within a few weeks, the IDF was back in Gaza. And he keeps saying, when he's asked to speak, he's saying, I'm not going to speak. Our actions will speak for us. That is how a chief of staff should work, in my opinion. This is radically different from how Herzi Halevi operated. He repeatedly in the public domain offered political and policy advice to the government in a way that contrasted the government's position publicly. I don't think there is any chief of staff in any other democracy that could do that and get away with it. and this is, this is what we're dealing with. So at the end of the day, look, I think this is a crisis. It's a very serious crisis. I have a lot of opinions, and I'm not going to go into all of them because I, first of all, don't want to get into the politics. I will say that at a most fundamental level, I believe the government has every right to fire the head of the Shin-Bet, and I think that the Supreme Court should not deny the government the right. However, if they do deny the government the right, I think the government still has to listen to the Supreme Court, because if they don't, then we're going to have a constitutional crisis. So that's kind of where I am. I think this should have never arrived at the court in the first place, because it just sets up the country for a major crisis. And at the end of the day, this harms security in a way that's very harmful. That's more or less how I see it. How do you see it, Benjamin? What do you think is going on here?
Well, I think we're in the midst of a completely bizarre turn of events, quite frankly. Now, there are a number of people who were in situ during the horrific massacre of October the 7th. Certain individuals are key players in the establishment and the ensuring of the security of the citizens of the States of Israel. And those individuals include, surely, the Prime Minister of the States of Israel at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu. They include the Minister of Defense at the time, Yoav Gallant. They certainly include the head of military intelligence at the time, Aaron Khaliva, Major General Aaron Khaliva. They include the Chief of the General Staff at the time, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. They also include the commander of the Southern Command, that would be Yaron Finkelman. And they suddenly include head of the Shinbet, Ronen Bar. These individuals, there are others as well, but these individuals really are the people with whom Israel charged, or to whom Israel gave the responsibility to defend and protect the citizens of the one and only Jewish state. And all of these people on their watch presided over the most horrific disaster, the details of which I don't believe we need to rehash here in this conversation, the most horrific disaster to befall the Jewish people since the horrors of the Holocaust. And it's my firm view that each and every one of those individuals should be dismissed. Every single one of those individuals should be dismissed. And I was of the view that they ought to have been dismissed in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th. I was dismayed that some of them hung on for as long as they did in their positions beyond October the 7th. But I want to make something very clear to the listeners when it comes to this matter. Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi resigned from his position. He has been succeeded, as you mentioned, by Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir. But Halevi did resign, and he resigned having expressed that he takes responsibility for what occurred on October the 7th. Aaron Khaliva, who, in my opinion, is perhaps the worst of all culprits in this particular story for reasons I won't get into now, Aaron Khaliva did the very same. He resigned, and he expressed that he takes responsibility for the failure of October the 7th. The same with Finkelman of the Southern Command,
Yeah.
and we can really run through the list. There's a list of others, incidentally, at slightly lower ranks, but an array of individuals have resigned while taking responsibility for what occurred. Now, we have two anomalies to that pattern. The first one, we actually have three anomalies to that pattern. Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant did not resign. Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant was fired by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He accepted, obviously, the will of the Prime Minister. He didn't seek to adjudicate it through the Supreme Court, and he left his role and his position as Minister of Defense, and he did so because of what took place on October the 7th, but also because of a breakdown in communication and, frankly, the ability to work functionally broke down between him and Prime Minister Netanyahu without assigning blame for the deterioration of that dynamic. That is what took place. That is what happened. And those two things, the failure of October 7th, the breakdown of the relationship, are what precipitated the firing of Yoav Gallant. Then you have another anomaly. You have Ronen Bar. Now, Ronen Bar is the individual whose dismissal is being deliberated in the Supreme Court at this time, specifically whether or not the Prime Minister has the right to dismiss the head of the Shin-Bet. Now, Ronen Bar has accepted his role in the failure and the disaster that was October the 7th. There is also clearly a very serious conflict of interests at the moment at play because Ronen Bar is leading the investigation into what you have called Qatargate, namely this investigation as to whether or not various individuals within the staff of Prime Minister Netanyahu are on the take from Qatar and were leaking stories, preparing stories, crafting stories to the media that were favorable toward the Qataris, oftentimes, incidentally, at the expense of honest coverage with regard to the Egyptians. That's a separate story in and of itself. But given that the head of the Shin-Bet is leading that investigation, and given that the head of the Shin-Bet has a uniquely close relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel under normal circumstances, there is obviously going to be a debilitating conflict of interest between the head of the Shin-Bet and the Prime Minister that will prevent them from having the businesslike, professional, impactful, effective relationship that I would argue is a prerequisite for the successful deployment of the head of the Shin-Bet to do the business that they are brought in to do. That's number one. The other thing that I find absolutely bizarre is that Ronen Bar somehow believes that he is able to at once say, I am responsible for the failure that took place on October the 7th. I take responsibility, or I take the responsibility for my role, my portion of that failure. But I absolutely must remain in my position no matter what. And by the way, nobody has any right to dismiss me. And by the way, certainly not the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, who I am now investigating. That to me is absurd. It is a completely absurd situation. And I cannot understand how anybody can look at that circumstance and say that it is anything less than the tyranny of the security forces and the security establishment. You have the head of the Shin-Bet essentially saying, I am accountable to nobody, absolutely nobody, when it comes to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office. Such a standard cannot stand. It must not be established. Now, in case anybody's wondering, well, Benjamin, you listed a number of people who were responsible for the failure of October the 7th, and you said that they should all resign, and you said that they should have resigned and been dismissed earlier on in the war, but you haven't made any mention about Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let me be very, very clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu, in my opinion, should have stepped down from his position as Prime Minister following the horrific failure of October the 7th. Now, there are many, many people who will make robust defenses of the Prime Minister and express things like, nobody woke him up during the morning of October the 7th. Nobody told the Prime Minister that there was this clear and present threat on the other side of the border inside the Gaza Strip. How could the Prime Minister have possibly acted in order to prevent that from taking place when nobody informed him that there was that imminent threat and imminent danger? To me, it doesn't really matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is that the forced buildup, the excavation of the tunnels, the tunnel network, the tunnels in which our hostages are being held, the tunnels that Hamas are still using, incidentally, below the ground inside the Gaza Strip. So much of that was the result and the consequence of a deeply flawed policy that Prime Minister Netanyahu championed over many, many years, which was namely to seek to pacify the Gazans by way, Hamas rather, to seek to pacify Hamas by way of providing them monetary support funneled into the Gaza Strip from Qatar. And all of that rose up, all of that flawed policy culminated in the horror of October the 7th. And therefore, I believe that the Prime Minister should have stepped down in the face of that terrible, terrible strategic failure that everybody witnessed. And in addition to that, ultimately, as the leader, as the elected leader of the country, I'm sorry, but the buck stops exactly there. If you are the elected prime minister and such a travesty happens on your watch, while the doing is not yours, the responsibility ultimately is. But here's the distinction between Ronen Bar and Prime Minister Netanyahu. individuals, including individuals serving at the highest echelons of the security establishment, serve at the pleasure of the prime minister. And so if the prime minister becomes displeasured by their presence, that is a sufficient reason, whether it be a popular decision or not, for that individual to be dismissed. At bottom, they serve at the pleasure of the prime minister.
And the government, yeah.
The prime minister serves at the pleasure of the electorate. And therefore,
Exactly.
if the prime minister wishes to stay in situ, which clearly he does, the only way to dislodge a prime minister, the only legitimate way, the only reasonable, the only acceptable way to dislodge a prime minister from his seat is for elections to be called as and when that may be, and for the voter to let its opinions be known, to let their opinions be known at the ballot box. That is the way that things work in Israel. By the way, there's a name for this process. It's called democracy.
Yep.
It's called democracy. And so when people are in uproar about the idea that an individual who resolutely failed to do his duty on October 7th, and I'm talking about Ronen Bar, who has said that he is responsible, but who has also said, I'm not going anywhere. When people are up in arms about that, I wonder, how do they expect the function of the state to continue? How do they expect the prime minister to have the confidence of the head of the Shin-Bet under these current circumstances? And I'm wondering, have they forgotten, when they seek to equate the obduracy and the stubbornness of Ronen Bar with the position of Prime Minister Netanyahu, have they forgotten that the prime minister has no body other than God sitting above him, discharging him, telling him when, where, how, for how long he can remain in situ? He does not have such an individual. There is no such individual. And the fact that we've come to this position where there's this absurd spectacle taking place in the Supreme Court, with justices wondering, is it legal? Is it not legal? Can you do it? Can you not do it? Can the prime minister fire the head of the Shin Bet? To me, is so regrettable. But more than it being regrettable, it is quite frankly completely absurd. And I'll just say one other thing, Yaakov, and then I'm going to hand it back to you. Arriving to the court hearing in support of Ronen Bar were several individuals, including Yoram Cohen, who was a former head of the Shin Bet, including Tamir Pardo, a former head of the Mossad, including Roni Al-Sheikh, the former head of the Israeli National Police, and others. And when I look at a bench that is filled with individuals such as that, who have turned up specifically to show their opposition to the ability of a prime minister, in this case Benjamin Netanyahu, to dismiss the head of the Shin Bet, I look and I wonder, how functional is any of the communication between the prime minister and any branch of the security establishment? I think it's improved with Eyal Zamir, the current chief of staff, to the point that you made earlier, but I fear for what this representation of former heads of key positions within Israel's security establishment, I fear for what that representation is actually showing us and telling us, merely by its manifestation there on the front benches of the Supreme Court, saying, on our watch, we will not allow or support the dismissal of Ronen Bar by a duly elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel. It's very concerning to me.
Yeah. And by the way, another way to get rid of a prime minister democratically is a vote of no confidence in the Knesset. That's the second way, in addition to what you said about elections. And listen, I agree with what you're saying here. There are a lot of things going on, but the thing that bothers me the most is that, as I said, first of all, I think that the vast majority of what we're seeing is politics disguised as many things that it is not. Politics disguised as fights for democracy, politics disguised as fights for security, and I think it's all hypocrisy. This is politics, and if these security chiefs want to go into politics, that's absolutely fine. They can follow the paths of other security chiefs, former chiefs, such as Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz, and go and join a political party. But so long as they are in service, they should not be playing politics. It is very, very destructive. None of that takes away from Netanyahu's own responsibility, strategic responsibility for the 7th. I agree with what you're saying. But here's the thing that really bothers me. I think that after the 7th, and I know this is not a very popular opinion, but I don't really care anymore. So I'm just going to share it. I think that after the 7th, and I'm not going into why, but the fact is that Netanyahu completely changed his strategic decision making regarding the existential threats and enemies that Israel faces. And again, the motivation doesn't interest me. I don't care about why he did it. I just think that it's obvious that that transition, that 180-degree shift has occurred. And I think we see that on every front, on every arena, we are seeing that. And so when people who are politically opposed to Netanyahu, which again is absolutely legitimate, when they take that extra step and say, this is a politically motivated war and we need to stop the war, that's when I get really concerned. Because what are the reservists and the conscripts supposed to think? They're being sent out there to do something which, in my view, is absolutely critical. And it shouldn't matter if you're for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu for you to see the need to eliminate what's left of Hamas in the same manner that the Allies had to eliminate what's left of the Nazis in 1945 and not stop at the gates of Berlin. If that's not obvious to people who are politically opposed to Netanyahu, if they are so keen on bringing him down to the extent that they're willing to grant Hamas a strategic victory in the Gaza Strip and sacrifice the Gaza border communities, which is what would happen, right? Because this is the part that I find maddening. This is the part that makes me think that I'm in a kind of house in mirrors, that all these people were saying we need to stop the war. They don't spend a single breath addressing, well, what would happen? What's the next day going to look like? What happens when Hamas sends another cross-border, even a small one, a squad, a terror squad, and kills, God forbid, 10 people in a dining room in a kibbutz? Is anyone going to stay in the Gaza border communities after that? This is what they're calling for, and they don't think one day ahead. And so, in my opinion, they have learned nothing from October 7th. They have learned nothing from the calamities that have befallen our people on that terrible day. And they have let politics blind them. And I think that that's, for those who should know better, that's terrible. And for those who don't know any better, I think that it's a kind of childish tantrum that they're in, where they say, we have to, another thing that I find incredible is those people who demand hostage deals, which again,
Hold on,
absolutely,
Yaakov. Hold on a moment,
it's
because
part, it's part of, it's just the last part. It's part and
okay, because
parcel
you're
of what
going into a very different
I
topic, and
think it's. I think
I'd
it's
like
not
to.
different.
Okay, go on. Finish
I
your
think it's
thought.
completely all part of the same thing.
Okay.
The people who demand hostage deals, which again, totally legitimate, and I supported the last deal, but then they say, why haven't we won the war? Netanyahu failed. When they just literally demanded a pause to the war and got what they wanted, okay? And then in the next breath, they say, oh, but Hamas is still on its feet. That to me suggests a cognitive failure, a failure of logic that can only be explained by political madness that has taken over all of their judgment. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, talking about judgment, I want to talk about another iceberg that we seem to be headed towards, and that is that there seems to be a letter that has been signed onto by what has been described as hundreds of reservists in the Israel Defense Forces from specifically the Israeli Air Force, expressing that they will not serve any longer as reservists in the Israeli Air Force for two reasons. Number one, the attempted dismissal of the legal advisor to the government. And secondly, the attempted, within that first reason, rather, the attempted dismissal of Ronen Bar, the current head of the Shin-Bet. And secondarily, they are not willing to continue to serve because they have decided that the return to war inside the Gaza Strip is exclusively a political decision that Prime Minister Netanyahu has reached. And this letter is a letter that Tomer Bar, not Ronen Bar, but Tomer Bar, who is the current head of the Israeli Air Force, and the newly appointed, relatively newly minted Chief of Staff of the IDF, Eyal Zamir, are both working feverishly to avoid the publication of. Now, I am dismayed, again, by the fact that thinking, concerned, sincere, earnest citizens of the State of Israel, who are also the soldiers of the State of Israel, soldiers in the Israel Defense Forces, our reservists, our mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters, in a post-October 7th reality, are yet turning back to a pre-October 7th reality and somehow reconciling themselves to the idea that it is appropriate for them to declare their refusal to serve in the Israel Defense Forces essentially because they have decided it is illegal to dismiss the head of the Shin-Bet, that it is illegal to seek to dismiss the legal advisor to the Israeli government, and that the return to the war is a purely political decision made by the Prime Minister of Israel. This to me is shocking. I'd like to know what you think about it. And I'd like you to address yourself to one question I have. Why is this, again, emanating from the Air Force?
I think it's exactly part of the same trend that I just described. It's politics dressed up as something else, which it is not. And anybody who believes that this is anything but politics, I think is either very naive or just delusional. Um, and this is what was going on before the 7th. We saw these scenes. Whoever drags the military into politics, whoever does that, is committing a crime against the military and against security. This is setting a precedent that is incredibly destructive. It's a game that anybody can play for wherever you sit on the political spectrum. You can say the government is doing something terrible, therefore this security activity is illegitimate. And by the way, there was some version of the letter that the media reported on that did not officially contain an active call to refrain from serving. That's their sort of defense, that they didn't. But it's obvious that this is where it's headed. The minute you say that a war is illegitimate, then the obvious and natural conclusion of anybody who would agree with that is that they shouldn't serve. So again, they're playing games. They're playing games, and it's politics, and it's dangerous, and it's disgraceful. And this is what we saw happening before the 7th. So I think it's just unforgivable to drag the military into this political feuding. I don't believe that it's anything other than politics. I don't believe them when they say that it's anything else. And it's very, very, very frustrating for me to see that we're making the same mistakes. Now, I know what they will say. They will say we would never do this if the prime minister didn't force us to do this. The prime minister is breaking the rules of the game, so we're breaking the rules of the game. And I think, again, this is just there's no logic in that claim, because again, the minute you condition military service on government policy, you're basically saying the military is finished. You're saying the military is finished because you can't have a military that is conditional really on almost anything. It
But
cannot be conditional.
one of the things that I think would distinguish, you said at the top of the program, Yaakov, that the way in which Eyal Zamir is conducting himself is very distinct to the way in which his predecessor conducted himself, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi. But here would be a very, very good opportunity for him to express and demonstrate the distinction between his way of doing things and the distinction of Herzi Halevi. Because if you remember, when this first started to bubble up in Israel, when we first started to hear about reservists being unwilling to serve and unwilling to report for duty, Herzi Halevi ended up going about quelling that in a very ham-handed, ineffective way that was really reflective of him not having any particular policy or opinion about what to do in the face of that challenge. I think that Zamir really does, not to specifically show that he is a different kind of chief of staff from Herzi Halevi, but also because of the obvious danger that emanates from these threats from among the reserve ranks. Eyal Zamir really has to rise up to this and clamp it quickly, very, very quickly, with maximal force, and quite frankly, lop off whatever is the cause of this encroaching, creeping threat to the efficacy of the Israel Defense Forces writ large. Don't you agree?
Yeah, and we've already had, a few case studies. We've had a number. This letter hasn't been published, right? So they're saying, Tomer Bar and Eyal Zamir are saying if this letter is published, whoever signs it is never serving in the reserves again. And we've already had case studies recently in recent weeks where I think two or even maybe three members of the Air Force, and I'm not sure if another branch of the military have called, have made political statements in the name of themselves as military officers and have been notified very, very quickly that they will never again serve in the reserve. So we've already seen a change. And the fact that this letter is not being published seems to suggest that some of these people understand that the rules have changed and this tolerance is over. So we'll have to keep a very close eye on this. My hope is, again, that we are seeing what we're hearing is not the majority view. I think, and that the vast majority of reservists will continue to understand and show up for service and understand that this is an existential fight and we're going to have to fight it no matter who is prime minister. This fight is going to have to be had and won. And also, a second thing that I'm worried about and hopefully won't come to pass is that this virus of politicization will spread to the conscripts. They're less prone to it. But these are still very, these are different generation. They hear everything that's going on. They're linked into their social media. And this can quite easily make the jump into the conscripts as well. So really, anybody who's promoting this is just playing with fire. It's incredibly reckless. And the fact that it's being done in the name of democracy, in the name of, being responsible is just absolutely absurd. I wouldn't buy any of that. I think it's really, really dangerous and hypocritical.
Well, we've started with two, frankly, pretty negative stories about what's going on among the Israeli security forces, and I think we should turn to something that's more reflective of the heroism and the dedication of the Israel Defense Forces, because we are hard at work taking the fight to Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. We are broadening the perimeter, that security perimeter that runs along the north, the east, and the south of the Gaza Strip. We are taking territory, the inference being that we're going to hold that territory in an effort to drive Hamas back to the negotiating tables. So far, Hamas has not come back to the negotiating table, but that could change, may change. Very reflective of a real determination on the part of the government and on the part of the chief of the IDF to ratchet up the pressure against this terror organization until such time that they recognize and understand that the taking and holding of hostages is far more of a liability than it is an asset. This is something that seems to be the decision of the Israeli government, namely that they want Hamas to understand that as long as they hold the hostages, they are going to have the noose tightened around their neck by the IDF, by the conscripts who are fighting, by the reservists who are fighting, to present the other side of the coin from the letter that we just spoke about in our earlier item. And I think that the IDF is on the march again. I think that the IDF is having great, great effectiveness inside the Gaza Strip. And that, of course, is testament, as I said, to the dedication of the soldiers, to the dedication of the conscripts, to the dedication of the reservists, and also to that change of mindset, namely that you cannot allow Hamas to reconstitute itself and you cannot accept a reality where 59 of the 252 hostages remain that were taken on October 7th remain inside the Gaza Strip, 24 of whom, if I remember correctly, are believed to still be alive. The fight continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are actually some quite dramatic things going on. Earlier today, a few hours before we spoke, the defense minister visited what they called the Morag corridor. And I think we talked about this last week. That's that corridor that runs parallel to and north of the Philadelphia corridor. So if you look at the map of Gaza, it's a little bit north of the Gaza-Egypt border, and it separates Rafah from Khan Yunis, and the IDF has taken it over and created a new corridor. And what the defense minister said, Israel Katz, and I'm reading his statement as we speak, is that if Hamas doesn't very quickly start releasing the hostages, the IDF is going to shift towards high-intensity combat all over the Gaza Strip until the release of the hostages and the defeat of Hamas. And he also visited the commander of the 36th Armored Division, which is operating in this area. So what we're seeing so far is a very gradual yet very clear escalatory series of steps by the IDF. We have troops and armored corps units on the ground in northern Gaza, central, and in southern Gaza. And there's not a night that goes by where there are not dozens of airstrikes targeting senior Hamas terrorists, including, by the way, in recent hours, the 3rd Battalion commander of the Sajaiya Battalion, which is in central Gaza, I guess more northern Gaza, east of Gaza City. The third one since the war, the 3rd Battalion commander of Hamas, was targeted in a major airstrike in recent hours. So there's a lot going on. And really, Hamas is being pummeled. And they're losing territory by the day. And if we take Katz at his word, if Hamas remains entrenched in its position, they're going to lose all of Gaza, and Israel and the IDF is going to take over the whole of Gaza. Now, what happens after that? I think the two immediate questions will be, first of all, hostages, and second of all, aid distribution. And I have a few ideas about the scenarios. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I think that this is absolutely the right thing to do, because at the end of the day, one of the war goals is the destruction of Hamas as a terror army and as a political regime that cannot be neglected for any reason, in my view. And of course, if there is an opportunity for the release of at least 10 to 11 living hostages, as Israel is demanding, then I personally would support a pause in operations, not a retreat of troops, but a pause in order to facilitate that. I think that that's important. And if not, then we have to start looking, at the rescue operations, as risky as they are, because Israel has to make an effort to get those people out. So it's very tough regarding the hostages. But
the only thing I'd
yeah,
pull you up on there, Yaakov, is that
yeah,
there's something that I don't agree with you about. The rescue operations, in my view, are being looked at. It's not as though they're not being looked at. I mean, I think that you know this as well. They're looked at, they're
yeah,
assessed, they're
but acted
carefully
on, acted on.
Okay, now that's very, very complicated
Yeah,
to say, and I know that you're someone who appreciates the complexity, but the calculus there is it really comes down to the consideration of any number of things. But two of those considerations for our audience to keep in mind is, number one, can we extract, assuming it's a living hostage that we're seeking to rescue? And by the way, the IDF has shown that it's willing to launch rescue operations for the remains of hostages, incidentally. But let's take the case that it's a living hostage. The question is, can we extract a living hostage alive by way of a given planned operation? That's always at the forefront of the minds of the decision makers. And the other question is, what is the risk to the soldiers who are being deployed forward to carry out that operation? Now, and so I just want to, well, quite frankly, I want to disagree with you, and so I will do. I don't think that there is any lack of assessing whether or not the rescue operations can take place. I believe it to be, I know it to be being looked at day and night, night and day, in an ongoing fashion since October 7th until this very day. And I don't think that it's reasonable to say that they're not being looked at, and if they are being looked at, they have to be acted on. I think that it needs to be viewed on a case by case basis in a very, very cautious, very professional, almost clinical way. That's my view on it. Tell me what you're driving at when you say they need to be acted upon. Are you saying no matter what, damn the
no,
risk, who cares what happens? Refine what you're saying, if you would.
no. I think that there have been reasonable. I suspect that there
Hmm.
have been opportunities that were risky, but not a death sentence. That were not acted on. That's my suspicion. Now, I'll give you an example. When Israel resumed the combat against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, I think about 3 weeks ago, the hostages were moved from apartment buildings to the tunnels. We know that because Hamas themselves have told us that. Now, that movement, when they were moved out, and that was a very predictable move, that's a vulnerability. That's a weak spot. And I can't help but wonder if
Well, you
opportunities.
mean you mean it's an opportunity, right? You're saying that that
Yeah, for
movement is an
Hamas, it's a weak
opportunity,
spot. Yeah, for
right? And
Hamas,
it's
it's
an
vulnerable.
opportunity for a rescue operation
For
as
a
an
potential rescue operation. Yeah. Now,
Mm.
my suspicion is that even though there were operational opportunities, the fear is what would happen to the remainder of the hostages, because there are not that many left. My suspicion is that operational opportunities were missed, even though there were some of them were reasonable or approached the reasonable level for fear of what would happen to the remainder of the hostages. And we know that Hamas has killed hostages in the past. So I think there's a whole host of considerations. I'm not trying to get into the heads of the operational planners, but I reserve the right to, let's say, be critically suspicious of and to hold the idea that perhaps opportunities were missed and that we have been overcautious. And I can't rule that out. Maybe you can. I cannot rule that out. And I think that it's something that is going to remain unknown until the future, when the class, when one day perhaps it'll be declassified. Obviously, not now, but I can't let go of that suspicion that we have missed opportunities, and maybe it was the right thing to do. I don't want to second guess the judgment of the commanders on the ground. I know that they're incredibly experienced. I know that they don't want to get their people killed or the hostages killed. I fully understand that, but I think that the alternative is also disastrous, of letting them languish for possibly for years, some of them in the dungeons of Gaza, and therefore, maybe some of the caution should be replaced with boldness. We've seen it in the past; it's worked. So I'm just leaving it out there. I'm putting it out there as a question mark.
So look, I can't sit here and say to you that I know whether or not rescue opportunities were missed or squandered or weren't acted on swiftly enough. I cannot rule that out. But what I would rule out is the notion that there is a lack of audacity in the positive sense on the part of the Israeli Defense Forces. I think that they know very well how to carry out the most audacious rescue efforts and rescue operations that, frankly, any military anywhere on the face of the earth has ever carried out. And I believe that's very much still within the DNA of our special operators. I also believe that the desire, the paramount, uppermost desire to return these hostages alive and to recover the bodies of the hostages who are no longer alive remains paramount within the moral dedication of the members of the IDF. So I really do have a very difficult time believing that the lack of successful rescue operations or even attempted rescue operations is the result of a lack of audacity. I just don't accept that. I don't think that describes the IDF that I know, and I don't think it describes, incidentally, the IDF that you know either. We've seen several of these operations already take place, not as many as we would like, and I think it's probably because there's a question of whether or not the hostages can be pulled out of their still possessed of life, and how many soldiers they would lose in the event that they launched the operation. But in addition to that, it's worth us thinking about, Yaakov, that Hamas also announced that it had changed its modus operandi, that in the event that it got wind of the idea of a rescue operation, the hostages would be shot and killed. We saw that during the murder of the 6 hostages. Hirsch Goldberg Polin is one such hostage among the 6 who were brutally killed. The hostages were pulled in many cases from their overland captivities to their below ground cages. And so the whole notion of carrying out a successful operation to extract a hostage has become much more complicated, much more laden with risk. But I don't think that it's avoided because of a lack of audacity. I don't believe that to be the case.
I don't think there's a lack of audacity at the level of the combat practitioners, the tactical commanders, but at the top, I'm not sure, Benjamin. I mean, you've got one of the the headquarters in the IDF that was set up, the missing persons and hostage headquarters, which is headed by Major General Nitzan Alon. Their primary mission is to collect intelligence on the hostages, right? Where they are, where they're being kept, what their conditions, and to identify operational opportunities for potential rescue missions. That's their primary mission. But instead of doing that, the government has sent Nitzan Alon for endless rounds of negotiations. Now I have to ask, when he goes to run to negotiations in Qatar or wherever else it's being held, and takes his team with him, Doesn't that take away resources from planning operations? I don't know, but it doesn't seem right to me that the people who are in charge of gathering intelligence on the condition of the hostages are being sent to negotiate. I think that that was a huge error to begin with. I have no objection to negotiations. I have big objections to sending the commander of the headquarters, who's in charge of gathering intel on the hostages, as a negotiator. And I think that may have harmed our attention as a country, as a military, to rescue opportunities. I can't help but wonder. I just can't help.
Okay.
I think it was a mistake.
Well, it's your right to raise these questions, obviously, and it's your right to pose these questions, and it's important to do so. I want to turn to two last matters, if we may, if we can, Yaakov. The first one is the we'll go in a different order, actually. I want to talk about Lebanon. There is an idea being floated that Hezbollah would lay down its weapons if Israel would withdraw from the five hilltops that it is still ensconced atop and move all of the forces of the IDF out of southern Lebanon. There is an idea, incidentally, one of the agreements made, or one aspect of the agreements, the agreement that was made, this ceasefire agreement, which really hasn't resulted in a ceasefire of any kind, in my opinion, certainly not an effective, realistic ceasefire. There was an idea that the Lebanese armed forces were going to become the sole bearers of arms in Lebanon, that Hezbollah would no longer be the bearer of arms, certainly not to the level that it currently does, and that everything essentially south of the Litani River, some 20 kilometers into southern Lebanon, everything there would essentially be pacified. And the negotiations for that singular possession of arms, those are yet to take place. They still have not taken place. Joseph Aoun, the newly minted president of Lebanon, has not moved judiciously in order to disarm Hezbollah. I don't think that there's any way that Hezbollah should be allowed back to the border, armed or unarmed. I don't trust them when they say they would disarm, obviously. I incidentally don't believe that the Lebanese civilians should be allowed to be right on the border with Israel, because I firmly uh, am of the view that one of the primary lessons to be taken from October the 7th is that you cannot have the enemy right on your border, but also you cannot have the citizenry of Gaza or of Lebanon right on the border, because it's from among the citizenry that these terror organizations recruit. It's from within the citizenry that they ensconce their terror armies and their terror capabilities. And it is from among the citizenry that these terror organizations derive their sympathy and their moral support. These are just a few of the reasons. So, for those considerations and others, neither the terror organizations nor the citizenry of Gaza or southern Lebanon can be allowed to be proximate to our borders. And I wanted to know whether you think that there's reason to be optimistic about Hezbollah's declared readiness to perhaps lay down its arms on condition that Israel, prior to them doing so, withdraws from these five hilltops.
I'm laughing because it's funny to me as that this proposition would even be discussed by anybody. And I know, and I'm glad that you're doing it, because it's important, for the viewers to understand how ridiculous it is for anybody to take that claim seriously. Hezbollah will never willingly disarm. This is just a ruse that they threw out there to pretend towards the Lebanese population that's not their base, that that they're willing to do their part to calm things down, because they want calm right now in order to rebuild their terror army. So this is just another a tactic that they're using to basically deceive other Lebanese citizens, and it's not working. Now, look, in terms of the ceasefire, here I disagree with you, because we are finally in a situation where there's a ceasefire. We used to be in a situation where Israel held its fire and our enemies were firing, and it was never a ceasefire as far as our enemies were concerned. And here we're in the opposite situation. There's not a day that goes by where Israel does not take kinetic action against Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is not firing a single bullet or
Yeah,
rocket in response.
Yaakov,
hold on
all true,
one
but
sec.
just to be clear, that is
Yeah,
not a ceasefire. That's the opposite of a ceasefire. That is military engagements. You're describing
yeah,
military engagements.
yeah. But this is the best situation that we have seen in Lebanon in decades, as far
I
as
don't
Israel is
disagree, but
concerned.
you can't call
Yeah.
it a ceasefire. It's
No,
not a
well, listen,
ceasefire. It's
Hezbollah,
something else. You're a wordsmith. Come up with a different name, but it's not a ceasefire.
Hezbollah is holding its fire, and Israel is enforcing the agreement that led to the end of the war in Lebanon with firepower. Now, look, what you said about the Lebanese army, I think, is absolutely correct, and let me give you an example of how correct it is. Um, Hezbollah was building basically it took an underground weapons factory in Dakhia in their stronghold of southern Beirut. It was bombed earlier in this war by Israel, and they started rebuilding it, refurbishing it. They wanted to revive this underground weapons factory. Israel obviously at some point gets word of this, and what it does, as it often does, is it alerts the ceasefire mechanism, which is made up of the Americans, the French, the UN, and the Lebanese army, that this is going on. And this mechanism sends the Lebanese army out to inspect. And by some miraculous manner, Hezbollah got early notice of this inspection and disbands whatever activity they were doing just in time. Now, I can have a very, let's call it an educated guess about how they got hold of this. Hezbollah still has sympathetic Shiite officers in the Lebanese army, the Lebanese armed forces. This is the main problem, right? I think that the mainly sort of Christian leadership, the top echelon of the Lebanese army, is well intentioned, does want to see Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon. And some of the rank and file does too, but those Christian service, those Shiite service members in the Lebanese armed forces are simply too close to Hezbollah to be trusted. They're going to leak. They're going to send off tip-offs. They live in the same villages. And this is the biggest problem with the model of trusting the Lebanese armed forces. And this brings us back to what I was saying earlier. Israel isn't trusting anybody. It's saying, go ahead. We'd love to see you succeed, but if you don't, then the Air Force is going to be on its way. And really, Benjamin, I'm sure you've seen this as much as I have. There's not a single day, there's not a single 24-hour period where we haven't had strikes, and these are not cosmetic strikes. We're talking about eliminations, senior terrorists, Hezbollah, Hamas too, by the way, infrastructure, etc. Now, this is all going on. This is all encouraging to me. What I think is going to happen is that this is not going to end with airstrikes. I suspect what we're going to end up seeing is IDF ground raids in southern Lebanon in a way that resembles Area A of Judea and Samaria, where you could have a significant raid. They go in, they uproot the infrastructure, and then they exit. I think that that's going to be the next stage, assuming that the Lebanese army continues to basically fail. And perhaps they'll surprise us. Who knows? I'm happy for them to prove us wrong, that they're more capable than we thought. But the best part of what's going on in the north is that Israel isn't gambling on this anymore. That's the most important change. That's the lesson of October 7th, in my opinion, being applied in Lebanon.
Well, I agree that those are important changes. I'm going to double down and say that ceasefire does not constitute, Yaakov. I'm sorry, I don't care how you phrase it. That is not a ceasefire. You have just described the precise opposite of a ceasefire. And what's bothersome to me about all of this is that, I question whether or not it's worth me litigating this with you on this podcast. But I'm going to put my opinion forward nonetheless. Look, Hezbollah, without any justification whatsoever, entirely of their own volition, decided that they were going to terrorize Israelis in northern Israel after Israel in its entirety had been shocked to its core and terrorized by the horrific events of October the 7th, 2023. And Hezbollah said that they were going to do so in support of Hamas,
Yeah.
in support of the Gazan people. Now, as a result of that, as a result of the bombardment that came from southern Lebanon, and quite frankly, the fear that Israeli policymakers demonstrated when it came to the willingness to tackle that threat, right? To tackle that threat in a very decisive, swift manner. As a result of all of that, about 80,000 citizens of northern Israel were evacuated from their homes, essentially becoming refugees in their own lands, dispersed around various stopgap accommodations throughout central and southern Israel. And the promise was that the IDF would turn its attention to dealing with Hezbollah militarily if a diplomatic solution could not be thrashed out somehow. I don't think anybody ever really expressed that they had great faith in the notion that a diplomatic outcome could be struck. And within this pledge that Hezbollah would be tackled one way or the other was a repeated insistence by the government of Israel on the importance of a buffer zone, a geographical buffer zone being established with permanence somewhere between southern Lebanon and northern Israel on the South Lebanese side of the border. When the fight finally did come to pass and the IDF had the tremendous victories that we all bore witness to, not just the open field victories that we saw, but also some of the more clandestine operations, such as the detonation of the pagers and so on. When that came about, the fighting did us proud. All of us should be very, very, very supportive of what the IDF did there in southern Lebanon. But there was no serious pursuit made of a buffer zone. It does not exist. It is not there. And I think that the absence of it speaks to the total inadequacy of the deal that is currently on the table. There will not be any way, in the absence of a buffer zone, of ensuring or coming close to ensuring the security of our citizens in northern Israel, other than to act militarily in a manner that we are acting at the moment. But I think that it's very, very lamentable, because I must say that given what happened on October the 7th, and this is just my opinion, I would struggle, really struggle, to move back to a home that is so proximate to a citizenry that has shown enmity toward Israel and that has shown itself to be the launching pad for terror organizations such as, in this case, Hezbollah. So I really do think that it bears reminding ourselves of the fact that Israel said it would pursue a buffer zone. It did not bring about a buffer zone. And I think that that's resulted in a very precarious and unfortunate situation. That's all I wanted to say about the situation on the ground there inside.
Let me just ask you a question about that.
Yeah.
A buffer zone, the only way to achieve that is a security zone, right? Which we had in the 80s and the 90s. Would you want to see a reestablishment of the southern Lebanese security zone? Because you know what that entails. And I'm not suggesting anything in the question. It's a neutral question. And I'm genuinely curious about whether you would want to see that, because that's the only way I can perceive of establishing a buffer zone, is to expand the idea of ground presence, take over much more of southern Lebanon than we already have, which is right now, you could argue that there's a very thin buffer zone, those 5 posts, it's a very, very thin one. So would you want to see some sort of reestablishment of what Israel had in southern Lebanon in the 80s and 90s?
I do think that there needs to be this reestablishment of a buffer zone on the border with Lebanon. I do unfortunately think that it's necessary. By the way, I also think that it's very necessary inside the Gaza Strip. Again, I don't want to sound too repetitive, but this is my default position. They cannot be allowed to be so proximate to our borders, and the only way, in my opinion, that you effectively prevent that is by having a buffer zone. What the dimensions are of that buffer zone is less important to me. How much we show our resolve to enforce that buffer zone, to maintain that buffer zone, that I am very interested in. And it's my hope that, for example, the perimeter that's being established around the Gaza Strip is not something that we will turn a lax eye toward over the passage of time. And such would I like to see take place in southern Lebanon as well. So my answer to your question, Yaakov, is yes. My other final topic that I'd like to discuss today, and it's an enormous topic in and of itself, but we just don't have the time perhaps to develop it to its fullest. Prime Minister Netanyahu concluded another visit to the White House a mere 2 months, if I'm not mistaken, after his previous visit to the White House, ostensibly on the back of the tariffs that President Trump had levied against basically the international community, but in Israel's case, a 17.5% tariff on Israeli goods coming into the United States of America. Prime Minister Netanyahu very swiftly arrived in the United States, able to declare that the finance ministry of Israel had removed the tariffs that Israel was applying to US goods coming into the state of Israel. And during a long press conference in the Oval Office, a number of topics were discussed. And I quite frankly felt that the response that Prime Minister Netanyahu received on a number of those was nothing short of a disappointment. I include the statements made and the confirmations of President Trump's intentions to enter into direct negotiations with the Iranians at a very senior level, according to the president. I include the president, after hearing that Prime Minister Netanyahu had wiped out the tariffs Israel levies, the president saying, well, I'm not particularly committal about whether or not we're going to reciprocate. Remember, the president is always talking about these being reciprocal tariffs. He's not saying that he's actually going to remove now the 17.5% tariff that he's levied against Israeli goods coming into the United States. He's actually saying something very, very interesting, very, very distinct, which is, well, you're taking almost, he seems to be saying, well, you're getting a good deal from us because you get billions of dollars in aid from the United States of America. And so it's against that backdrop that I'm not going to commit to getting rid of the 17.5% of tariffs, which is a very, very, I would say, alarming adjoinment of two very, very different policies. It also doesn't accurately describe the nature of that military aid to Israel and what Israel is required to do with the military aid, namely spend it to the tune of 75-80% of the total funding on American hardware, right? It has to go on American hardware. That's something that a lot of people don't understand. And there was some positivity in there. For example, the president said that Prime Minister Netanyahu is working day and night to bring the hostages back. He hopes that the Israeli populace and understands that, so said President Donald Trump. But I didn't see too many wins for Prime Minister Netanyahu at all. What did you take away from that?
So I think the whole tariffs thing was a fig leaf. It wasn't the real reason for the visit.
I
It was a
agree. I
very
agree with you.
convenient excuse. They could have had that discussion on their classified version of Zoom. But I think there are two very major reasons why Netanyahu flew over from Hungary to Washington. And one is the beginning of direct negotiations between Iran and the United States over the Iranian nuclear program. I think Netanyahu is dead against these negotiations and has made his position behind closed doors clear to President Trump. And I think President Trump made it clear to Netanyahu that he's still going to try and get a deal. Now, we don't know what kind of deal Trump has in mind. So Netanyahu in Hebrew said that as far as Israel is concerned, what needs to happen is a Libya-style deal in which the whole Iranian nuclear infrastructure is disbanded, not a cessation of uranium enrichment like the old nuclear deal of 2015, but to destroy all of the nuclear infrastructure. Now, I think we all know that there's no chance that Iran is going to agree to that. And then Netanyahu says if that doesn't happen, then the military option is on the table. The big unknown is whether Trump agrees with that, if he thinks that that's what the right deal should look like. And so Trump is trying to apply the art of the deal on the Iranians. I think Netanyahu is uncomfortable with that. I think this was the main reason for the visit. They had it out behind closed doors. Are they coordinated? Are they not? I agree that they don't seem to be very coordinated right now, because if it was up to Netanyahu, I don't think these negotiations, which are due to start on Saturday in Oman, would happen. But Trump is doing so far what past American presidents are doing in a much more muscular fashion. He's moved the B-2s to Diego Garcia. He's bombing the Houthis. He's much more convincing than any past American president dealing with the Iranians. But he's gone into negotiations with them. And in that sense, he's doing exactly what the past presidents have done so far. We don't know where this is going. This is a really big question mark. And just before we started recording, Trump said on Fox News, or Fox News reported him saying that if it does come down to military action, Israel will lead that action, which is something I've believed all along. that the United States will not be leading any potential military strike on the Iranian nuclear program, but would actually, if anything, support the Israeli lead role. So I think that was topic number one. We have a lot more question marks than exclamation marks on that. And topic number two, I think, was Turkey. I think Trump heard from Netanyahu that the situation in Syria is very, very serious between Israel and Turkey, that Israel has no intention. And again, I think this is an application of October 7th lessons. Israel has no intention of letting Turkey or any of its jihadist, fundamentalist proxy forces in Syria to spread out and entrench themselves in Syria, certainly not in southern Syria, but we've also seen airstrikes on military bases all over Syria. T4, which is in central Syria, the Turks wanted to set up an Air Force base there, which would have been a huge challenge to the Israeli Air Force. T4 was bombed twice, I think, in the past 2 weeks. So, Israel and Turkey were on some kind of collision course, and I think that Netanyahu was telling Trump, "Look, if you can help de-escalate, that would be great, because obviously the last thing Israel wants is a head-on clash with Turkey." So I think those were the two real topics.
So, couple of things I'd like to add there. Firstly, we remember in 2019 that Donald Trump famously crossed the DMZ in order to visit and shake hands with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, something that he was strongly advised not to do, something that absolutely outraged his national security establishment. But this is not the first time that President Trump has said, I want the United States, whether it be at the level of the president or at a different level, to enter into direct negotiations with those entities and those states and those countries and those organizations from which we are seeking to extract some sort of a result. In the case of Iran, the distraction of and dismantling of its nuclear arms program. Now, we also saw. So just on that point, I'm not surprised by this. I'm not surprised, but I also am not supportive of it, but I'm not surprised by it.
Right.
I'm not surprised by it. I also think that one of the reasons that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were in the same room when this was announced, officially, declared officially, if you like, was the result of the debacle that came about when it was discovered by Israel that Adam Boehler, the special envoy for hostages, had been of his own volition, in his infinite wisdom, engaged in direct negotiations with Hamas without telling Israel. Israel caught wind of it. The allegation was that Israel then leaked it to the media, and it was said that Minister of Strategic Affairs Benjamin Netanyahu's right-hand man, Ron Dermer, made it very, very clear, very, very clear indeed, that Israel objected to such negotiations. And by the way, that Adam Boehler individual demonstrated himself to be very ham-handed when it came to justifying his decision in front of the media. He was asked about
He
it several
himself
times.
confirmed that he was doing that. Yeah.
He confirmed it, but as he confirmed it, he spoke about hostages using the wrong name. He spoke about Hamas terrorists as being. No, he spoke about hostages as being prisoners, and it was just a disastrous series of misstatements by this guy. In my opinion, demonstrated himself to be completely unqualified for the role for which he was selected. But on the back of that, I think it was probably decided that if direct negotiations are to take place between the US and Iran, it had better take place with the full knowledge of Israel. Okay. And then there was something very important about Benjamin Netanyahu pointing to the Libya model that I want our listeners to keep in mind. The Libya model is the model by way of which Gaddafi of Libya was pressured by the international community. Incidentally, the leader of that effort, in my opinion, was then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair. He was the individual who was most profoundly pressing for that. If you recall, Yaakov, Gaddafi did agree to disarm, and then just a few short years later, Gaddafi, in the absence of a nuclear weapons program, and in the absence of nuclear weapons capabilities, was killed at the hand of an angry mob of his own people in Tripoli inside Libya. So
After an
when
international coalition basically destroyed his regime. Yep, exactly right.
and so when Benjamin Netanyahu transmits this idea that he will accept the Libyan model, what I believe he's actually doing, and I don't think there's anything haphazard about any statement ever made by Bibi Netanyahu. What I believe he's doing is he is expressing to the Iranians, that they should actually perhaps not look for this to be resolved by way of negotiations, because, or he's basically trying to fend off the Iranians from arriving at the negotiating table by way of raising the scepter of the same
Hmm.
outcome that Gaddafi encountered, and expressing that that could, between the lines, be the outcome that the so-called supreme leader of Iran ends up facing
Interesting.
if he dismantles that. Now, there's another reason that I'm saying that, which is that you may recall when the negotiations, when the first efforts in the first Trump term were underway to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table on this issue of their nuclear weapons program, John Bolton, who was then the national security advisor for Donald Trump, expressed the same thing. He said, for very, very different reasons, this could go the way of the Libyan model, that the Iranians could abandon their nuclear weapons program in a manner similar to the Libyan model. I've already expressed what that Libyan model ended up bringing about for Gaddafi. Donald
Yeah.
Trump at that time was fuming, and he made a statement expressing that he was fuming with John Bolton for putting in the mindset of the Iranians that if they dismantle their nuclear weapons program, a la the Libyans, they may end up meeting with a similar fate to Gaddafi of Libya. So there's a lot there in that statement that Prime Minister Netanyahu
Yeah.
made about the Libyan model being the model that he wanted. I think that it's actually probably been very effectively transmitted to the Iranians, and I think that they'll probably take heed of that.
Well, very interesting. I think, the Iranians are certainly more than happy to try and split the US off from Israel when it comes to them and their nuclear program. And that's always been their strategy. They were quite successful in splitting the Europeans off from the US at a certain point. They're the best negotiators in the world, it has to be said. They really are the best negotiators that I've seen operate on the international stage. And their main goal is to buy time and wait out the Trump administration and wait for another administration, and then become maintain their status as a nuclear threshold state, and eventually become nuclear and rebuild their access of terrorists and terror armies, and pursue their jihadist dreams. So it's crystal clear what they're after. They've got the countdown clock in Palestine Square in Tehran. Israel, in their vision, is destroyed by 2040, and the nuclear program is designed to create this umbrella over their proxies to enable that. So, their strategy is crystal clear by now. By the way, I'm still hearing people shockingly say, no, they want the nuclear program for their own survival. It's unbelievable to me that people that think that still, that that's the main reason. And look, I think that at the end of the day, if the worst case scenario happens and Trump reaches a deal which is subpar with the Iranians as far as Israel is concerned, I'm not saying that I think this will happen because I really don't know, and I suspect that it probably won't happen. But let's assume that it does. The conventional wisdom, and I've heard this discussed last night in certain studios, is that Israel in that situation can't attack the Iranian nuclear program, and I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think that this is an existential issue, and even at the cost of a major crisis with the U.S., I believe Prime Minister Netanyahu, after October 7th, before he leaves power, or he before he may end up leaving power, will be very, very firm on the idea of not leaving a nuclear weapons program intact in Iran at whatever cost. I think that he's dead certain on doing that. So we'll have to see where all this plays out. But I think that determination by Netanyahu may end up causing Trump to change his calculus. And we'll have to see how this dynamic happens. There's a lot of question marks in the air. And the main thing is that Israel reserves its right to take action if necessary. I think that's the most important thing, and not to surrender to the idea that, oh, another subpar deal has been reached and we'll have to live with that for the next X number of years. That idea is very dangerous and should not be taken as some sort of gospel truth. I've heard it discussed in studios last night, and I just couldn't believe that I was hearing it. So,
Well, Yaakov,
yeah,
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I believe that Israel has the ability the military capability to dismantle Iran's nuclear weapons program by itself. I do not accept the idea that Israel should not strike that program because, at best, as we hear from those who've objected, frankly, for many, many years now, at best, Israel can only roll back that program by a few years. We all know from the experience in Syria, where we detonated the reactor in 2007, that anything can happen in the Middle East, and Syria is a very, very far cry from reconstituting anything that even remotely looks like a nuclear weapons program. We know it from Osirak in
yeah,
1981 when we detonated the nuclear weapons program there. Iraq never reconstituted itself to a position whereby it had a nuclear weapons program and was armed with nuclear weapons. And I think that in essence, as I've said many times, it really just comes down to political will. It really comes down to whether or not there is sufficient determination among the leadership of Israel in order to bring this about. And while I absolutely believe that Israel can do this on its own and should do it on its own, I'm even more certain that were it to join forces with the Americans, it would certainly be able to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons program. I actually don't put too much stock in Donald Trump's statement that in the event there's a military strike, Israel will lead that strike, because you can pass those words out however you wish. It could say Israel will be first to strike, but America will be right behind it. It could mean that Israel will lead that strike without the United States of America. It could also be part of Donald Trump's stated, declared determination not to telegraph what his military strategy is when it comes to matters of importance to the national security of the United States of America and the promotion of the interests of America overseas. So I don't really attach too much significance to that. The question is the political will there? You seem to be saying that it probably is now. I believe we'll wait and see, but I'm firmly of the view that this can be done. It needs to be done, and therefore it should be done. And I am very hopeful that it will be done, because the moment really is upon us. The last thing that I want to say, Yaakov, is that I want to take this opportunity to wish all of our listeners a Pesach Sameach, a happy Passover, and of course, as we know from the tradition of the Pesach Seder, we can never ever have a heart filled with joy. Our cup can never really overrun when we consider the suffering in the story of the Haggadah of our enemies, the suffering of the Egyptians, right? Which is why we take our fingertips, we dip it into the cup of wine, and we pour out one drop of wine per plague that was visited upon the Egyptians. Kal v'chomer, how much more so can we not truly celebrate this Pesach, this Passover, when our hostages, our beloved hostages, 59 of them, 24 of them believed to be alive, remain in captivity, remain in bondage inside the Gaza Strip. And so may this Pesach may it truly prove to be a festival of redemption. May our hostages come home. May they be reconciled with their families. May those families know closure, and may they know peace. And may there be peace on all the house of Israel this Pesach. Yaakov, thank you so very much for being with me, and thank you for running down some concerning, some very inspiring aspects of what's taking place in Israel at this time. I always appreciate it.
likewise.